Welcome, all you wiretappers out there, back here in the studio, Gangland Wire. I'm on a Zoom call with some guys that have been on here before. My friend Camillus Robinson, Cam Robinson, and been on here several times before. Cam, welcome. I'm glad to have you back.
As always, I'm glad to be here, Gary.
So you also, a lot of you are going to know this next man. He's really well known in the mob history. He's kind of one of the early guys in this mob history world. Rick Porrello from Cleveland. Rick, welcome.
Thank you, Gary. Good to be back with you and Cam.
Now, Rick, when I kind of wasn't even thinking about ever doing a podcast, I might have done that. I was getting ready to do my first documentary on the mob here in Kansas City, on the mob and the skim. And Kill the Irishman came out, and I saw your documentary back then, and and then the movie came out, and I saw it, and it was great. You're a real inspiration. I want to tell you right now, man, you inspired me.
Absolutely.
You were a cop too, and you did all this stuff. So hey, if he can do it, I can do it.
Thank you. Yeah. I've heard from a few like regional mob authors that it kind of said the same thing. Makes me feel good because it was really my first book was one of the first books, the mafia history books that was outside of New York, outside of Chicago, outside of Las Vegas. And then after that, you started seeing more and more, Kansas City, Philadelphia, Miami.
Yeah, really, they're all over the place now. I tell you, on YouTube, the field is getting crowded on the mob history world with all these mobsters that are now got YouTube channels. Sammy the Bull and Michael Franchise and
right.
Bobby Luisi and Jimmy Calandra. I tell you, I don't know how many they are.
Yeah,
Tom Panisi.
I think you definitely opened the door for a lot of people, Rick. I mean, certainly. I mean, I'm out here doing it because I've read your site and your books and your movies. So I mean, I definitely.
You have been an inspiration to us all, Rick. I'll tell you right now.
Well, it's kind of a strange thing to think that it's really my grandfather's murder back in 1932 during Prohibition that really was the spark that started this whole thing. I never thought that I'd get to a fourth book as I was working to finish that first one. But it's been fun. It's been well received. I've been fortunate. I've been blessed, really.
Well, we all appreciate you. So today, we're going to talk about bombs, bullets, and bribes, the true story of notorious Jewish mobster Alex Shonder Burns. And folks, there's a book. You need to get this book. It's real readable, and it's about a mob guy that kind of has always flown under the radar, but was really important in that Cleveland family. And the Cleveland family is really important outside their own region. Their connection to the Teamsters, and they sent their early Jewish guys with Mo Dalitz and another guy to Las Vegas.
Kleinman.
Yeah, Morris Kleinman to Las Vegas and get that going, and it's a pretty important family. Now, Rick, you probably will go back with him, Killing the Irishman, and remember that. And Killing the Irishman, the Christopher Walken character was Shonder Burns. Did you get a chance to talk to him about playing that part?
No, I didn't talk to him personally, but I read an interview that he did, and I kind of laughed a little bit when he said he was surprised to find out that Shonder Burns was actually a real person. But then he said he had a feeling he was going to play his character more like Chris Walken than Shonder Burns. Not something that a nonfiction author who spent 5 years researching a story wants to hear.
Really.
But then again, what a thrill to have Christopher Walken in the movie.
You got that.
So he had no argument for me, that's for sure.
I don't remember him saying more cowbells.
Unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to meet him. The producer called me at the hotel and said, "Hey, come on down. Chris Walken's here." And then we started to leave. I had my family, kids, 15 minutes later, we were ready to leave the hotel and get down there.
Yeah.
And the set was just about 10 minutes away from the hotel. But then the producer called me back and said, "Oh, forget it. He just left." So, but I did meet him. I met him and took a picture with him just very briefly at the premiere, the after party at the premiere in New York. So I have one photo with him and my wife.
Yeah, and I'll say this, that one thing that we'll get on this. I did like that movie personally. I did like that movie. I like that look, just like Goodfellas. I like that look at the mid-level mob guys who out there doing the deal. They're doing the deal, the real stuff. That's what makes organized crime work, is those guys like that. And then when you get wars between them, then it gets even better. So that's I really appreciated it from that standpoint.
Yeah, not there. There's very few when you think about it, top guys out there that are living in the the really expensive home and don't have to worry about money and everything's getting kicked up to them. But the majority of those guys out there are the mid-level, lower level soldiers that are maybe in some cases struggling to make a living, and perhaps taking certainly a lot of the risk too.
Oh yeah. That's where the fun is. That's where the action is.
Yeah, street level is where the good stories are.
Really.
Yeah.
All right. So bombs, bullets, and bribes. Tell us a little bit, kind of a earlier history on Shonder Burns.
Well, I'll tell you first, Gary, just briefly, that title, Shonder was a real womanizer. And the title was almost going to be Bombs, Bullets, Bribes, and Babes.
Oh, really?
But I went with my editor's argument that four words is probably too much. So we settled at Bombs, Bullets, and Bribes. But, I call him Cleveland. He really is Cleveland's most notorious Jewish racketeer. And he had connections all over Las Vegas, Florida, and New York, Pittsburgh, certainly. And he started off like a lot of these guys did, is sort of an associate of the early mafia in Cleveland, which was known then as the Mayfield Road Mob. And I think he had his first arrest when he was in his early 20s for breaking into a house. Then he stole a car, served some time, and then he fell in with the Mayfield Road Mob as sort of a soldier or associate, and became known kind of for helping them move in on the numbers racketeers, the illegal lottery. Back then it was known as policy. It was little balls that were drawn out of a bag to pick the winning numbers. And then in later years it became there was another game called Clearinghouse, which was a little bit harder to cheat. It became much more popular. But the Cleveland mob, as in other big cities, they moved in on that nickel and dime operation because it was very popular. There was a lot of money to be made with these nickel bets. Most of it was in the black neighborhoods, not all of it. And after that, Shonder kind of he was always allied with the Cleveland Mafia, but he was sort of independent. He didn't, I know before we started recording, Cam mentioned, you mentioned, Gary, the Jewish racketeers that were very big in Cleveland, Mo Dalitz and Kleinman, the Jewish boys, they call them.
John Rockman.
Yeah, and then Rockman in later years. But Shonder could have been part of that group, but I think he was a little too uncontrolled, a little bit too hot-tempered, and so I think he was satisfied as being an independent, and he eventually went on to take over, just like the Mayfield Road Mob did with the numbers racket, to take over prostitution in Cleveland, and then eventually got back involved in the numbers racket, and that's probably how he made probably most of his money through the years, into the 50s, 60s, and the 70s, being sort of a newspaper reporter described him as a league commissioner. He handled kind of overseeing and enforcing all the different games for the different operators, so that the odds were kept the same and guys weren't undercutting each other, and things ran smooth. Everybody was making money. The runners weren't cheating. And then if a guy got hit hard with a number that was, there was a lot of money bet on, and he would provide cash loans. And some of that money came from Southern Florida, guys like Pittsburgh, Jaime Martin, and who's the other guy? George, I'll think of his name in a minute. George Gordon, another, guy connected in with that upper level gambling gambling group, who were really just under Meyer Lansky, who of course is one of the real big names. So he was a big player. He was bigger. I'm talking about Shonder, bigger than life, and just a real character. And that's really that's really the big reason why I decided to devote about 5 years working on that story.
It interests me. I did have some questions about. There seem to be a lot of Jewish racketeers in Cleveland. The guys who went out to Vegas, as you said, the Jewish boys. You've got Kleinman and Dalitz and Rothkopf, and then, like you said, later you had May Schrockman, and I wondered where Shonder Burns fit into that. And it sounds like he had the connections nationwide, but he focused a lot on the gaming in Cleveland and could reach out when he had to. Is that sort of a fair assessment of where Burns was?
Yeah, I think he wanted to be sort of a bigger fish in a smaller pond. I think he was happy. He was more of a street guy. He was more of a street guy, and that was just his world, and he was comfortable with it, and he was comfortable with all of the connections that he made, starting off. Gary, you asked me about his earlier life, and he was a guy that organized relationships in his head. If he met a young guy who was maybe a law student who was frequenting one of his brothels, 5-10 years later, when that guy was working maybe as an assistant prosecutor or as a defense attorney, that came into his organization. It was a connection that he had, and he took advantage of those connections.
Interesting.
And that mob memory that's so comes in handy with those guys.
Did he do much in the labor racketeering there in Cleveland, or was that strictly left to the Italians?
Well, he was connected, but I don't think he was a major player in the labor racket. Although he certainly had a scam going. He would extort different companies and tout himself to be a sort of a labor problem solver, labor mediator. So if they had a problem, the problem created by Shonder himself, he would step in, and for a fee, he would, he would get those deliveries going, or he would get the vandalism to stop happening to the shop. So he got on different payrolls and just as sort of the protection racket, but he was a guy that I think he liked multiple streams of income. He was a hustler. And so he had a lot of things going. And like I said, he liked to work the streets. And I think that was his life was kind of was to live up to the reputation that he created by being Alex Shonder Burns. And it's just he was just quite a character.
He could serve as sort of a go-between with the Italians and with the other street. He was trusted all around, basically, as a central character. And I mean, you see him with Danny Green when Green went to work with him, but he was also the Italian saw him as, and like you described him, he was an intermediary. He could solve disputes on the street level because everybody sort of trusted Shonder. It's like in a way. I mean, he had that muscle. He had that respect from everybody.
Yeah, for sure, Cam. He was well respected by, I mean, almost everybody in the underworld, and he was, he also served an enforcement role for the, he had his own crew of enforcers, primarily for the numbers racket, but he had guys that would do other jobs. And it's funny, I didn't find out about one of the names, guy by the name of Robert Bogus, who was quite the hitman, at least according to one of his close associates, who wound up flipping and going to work for the for law enforcement. He gave quite an interesting statement. But Bogus was one of Shonder's key enforcers, and yes, he was definitely trusted by the Italians, trusted by the blacks. A lot of the black operators, they loved Shonder Burns, and he just was he was a charismatic guy, and he had a lot of connections also to police departments. He had his guys in the police department that would serve different roles, and of course that meant putting money out, and that was probably a little bit more so in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and then when you started getting into the 70s, that the police department sort of started to professionalize more, and there was more demand for accountability from the public. But yeah, he had his connections all over the place. Like I said, in Florida too, he'd fly down there and he'd spend winters and going to the dog track, the horse track, and fishing, going to boxing matches, and meeting with his buddies Jaime Martin, and sometimes he'd bring cash back, a loan that he would use to keep the whole numbers operation rolling. There was another guy, a mob associate I need to mention by the name of Tony Panzarella. They call him Pans, and he was sort of the connection when Cam mentioned like a go-between. He was probably more a go-between for Shonder in the mafia, the local the Cleveland mob, and he they sort of oversaw the numbers racket together. But at one point is when Tony Panzarella was in ill health, I think Shonder Burns was running it a little bit more himself with his crew of enforcers, probably going into the late 60s and late 70s. And then Danny Green comes into the picture too. And that's when Shonder has to go to prison. But we moved ahead a little bit quick there.
Mhm. He got started pretty young with Maxie Diamond, I read, who was an associate of Bill Preston, who was the joint counsel, was the joint counsel 41. So I mean, he was a young guy when he got started on the street initially.
You're talking about Shonder.
Shonder, yes, sir.
Yeah. He was under. If you keep going backwards, you always find.
Yeah.
You always find the boss who was the previous boss, and then as you move forward in time, you find that some guys rose up to become either bosses or certainly influential figures. And yeah, Maxie Diamonds, there's a guy who another, if you go back to the 20s and 30s, was another guy. You could call him Cleveland's most notorious Jewish racketeer, but back during Prohibition, had a big liquor business and rum running and all that. And yeah, Shonder worked for him for him too, and kind of came up under him, and then moved to the Mayfield Road mob, and then, like I said, eventually became his own man, independent, but was always respected and allied with the other guys.
So how did he navigate that with the Italians, with the mafia family there? Was he always just an earner for them? He had to be kicking somebody some money, I would think, but it seems different in Cleveland, so I'm not sure.
Well, for a long time, John Scalish was the boss. I think he started back in 1944, and he lasted until 1976 when he died during heart surgery. And he was a guy, my research has shown, that really didn't want to run things with an iron fist, because that would mean more heat from law enforcement. For instance, there were a couple guys, one by the name of Eugene Ciasulu, who wanted to organize. He was one of the soldiers and enforcers. He wanted to organize all the bookies so that they'd all have to kick up, and everything would be organized. They'd have a system going. And from what I understand, John Scalish said no, because he didn't want the intimidation and the threats and the violence that would come if clients didn't pay when they were supposed to pay, or if the bookies weren't kicking up like they were supposed to. But I think when it comes to Shonder and Tony Panzarella, I think they probably were kicking up a portion of what they were making, but it was a mostly a black operation. And again, the bets, especially even the 20s and 30s, you could even have penny bets, nickel bets. Maybe by the 40s and 50s, you started having quarter bets, and then the 60s and 70s, you had 50 cents and dollar bets. But they looked upon it differently, because it was mostly a black operation. So the the main, crew and the mafia and the bosses didn't want as much to do with it as they, as they would have to do with things like vending machines and gambling, other gambling operations and casinos and floating games and so forth. And of course, the skim money coming in from the Las Vegas casino. So they were kind of hands off with it. But I think Shonder and Tony Panzarella, they recognized that there was, and certainly the black numbers operators recognized that there was money to be made. And while I'm mentioning the black numbers operators, and there were a few white numbers operators, but the big ones were black. And you got to remember, one of the names was a guy by the name of Donald the Kid King.
Really?
In probably about the late 60s going into the 70s, Donald the Kid King emerged as Don King, the boxing promoter. But he was one of Cleveland's big numbers operators during the late 60s and early 1970s. There were maybe a half dozen big ones. Richard Drake, who is rumored to not be fathered by Arthur Drake, who was always known to be his father. But there's a little surprise twist for anyone who wants to read in the book. I won't give it away right now, but he was one of the big ones, and Don King, Shonder Burns, of course. And they were making a lot of money. It was a very popular game. My own grandparents played the number, and I think the guy in their neighborhood who controlled it around 105th and in Euclid on the east side was Arthur Drake. They called him Little Brother Drake, and he was the father of Richard Drake. And when Arthur died, that's when Richard took over his operation. So it's very popular enough that the state decided, hey, we need to get into this too. And they changed the laws. And then we had the Ohio Lottery Commission. And I think their first number was coincidentally, it was a 3-digit number, just like Clearinghouse had been. The Buckeye 3, I think it was called. And then, of course, you had lottery commissions popping up all over the place, in different states during the probably the late 60s, early 70s. Yeah. And all of a sudden, the gambling was legal. How about that?
Really?
I think when you talk about nickels and penny bets and quarter bets, I know that here in Chicago and in Northwest Indiana, I mean, you're talking millions of dollars were going into this. I think, as your research shown, was it? I mean, you're talking hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars were in the policy games. Is that about what you're looking at?
I can't have that number like in front of me, like on a whole state level or a whole state level or nationally. But I know these guys were making, like in some weeks they were bringing in like maybe $6,000 was coming in, and
per game, right?
Yes, most of that was profit. For other games within a 5-day week, because after I mentioned policy, now policy was easy to cheat with. That's what numbers racketeers started with back in the real early, the late 1800s going into the 1900s, and that was a bag. They put I don't know if it was 80 or 100 little balls they put in a bag. In fact, the Cuban version was known as bolita, which I think means little balls. So they have these 100 little balls, put them in a bag, and then a crowd gathers around, maybe in front of what they call a policy house. It was like a neighborhood party almost, and they'd have the drawing, and the drawer would reach in the bag and then pull out the balls, and those would be the winning numbers. But it was so easy to cheat, and I found it rather remarkable and creative, some of the ways they cheated with these games. The operators would take if there were balls that they didn't want pulled, because they would see how much money was bet on certain numbers. So if they had numbers that they didn't want pulled, before they went in the bag, they'd stick them in the freezer for like a half hour. So if the puller, the drawer reached in the bag and he felt a cold numbers, be like, oh, okay, can't pull that one, and he'd fiddle around. And then they also had balls that they would, like a second set of balls that they would shave. I have a picture of that in in the book. So they were shaved, they're concave or convex. I don't remember my terminology from high school, but it was very easy by feel to tell that that was a ball that you did not want to pull out. So, you know, that kind of cheating led to the popularity of Clearinghouse, which the numbers, the winning numbers were in Cleveland anyway, were determined by the stock market results, the wins, the losses, and unchanged. There were certain columns that came out every business day in the business news, and they would line up those columns, and that would be the winning number. Almost impossible to cheat. I think in Chicago they may have used horse
Yeah,
racing.
writing it off on the race. Yeah.
Yeah. But in Cleveland, it was the stock market figures.
Just a random number. Out in Kansas City, they did something called pulling the wheel, and it was some kind of a little machine they had that they'd spin, and it would come up with the numbers that would come up. They had this bar, or not bar, it was a liquor store, corner store, that he was the guy that pulled the wheel, and then they announced the numbers. And in Kansas City, nobody really paid any attention. The blacks were never bothered about the policy, and I don't really remember it. You know, a few people may have played the black game, but primarily it was a black game in Kansas City. And our family, our Italian family, never had any interest in that at all.
Yeah. Well, you know, the takeover, or at least extracting a profit, you know, from them, that was back to the 20s and 30s, and maybe lasted into the 40s. But by the time the 50s came around, you know, the black operators would get a little bit more organized, and they weren't having that anymore, you know. But they did work with Shonder only because he had the connections, like I said before, to the police departments.
Yeah.
He had the cash, you know, he had access to cash, and he had that group of enforcers that would go out, and if they had to rough up a guy because he, in fact, that's what would happen with Don King. Don King was shot in the head. Fortunately, it was with it was a shotgun blast, but it was with bird shot, and it was from enough of a distance that, you know, those tiny little pellets didn't prove fatal for him. But he was kind of going up against Shonder Burns, and I think it was that he had lowered his odds. I think the odds typically were 600 to 1. So if somebody had $1 bet and they won that $1 bet, they would make $600, or 50-cent bet would be $300. But I think at one point, Donald King lowered his odds to, or no, it was 500 to 1. But then Donald King raised his odds to 600 to 1, so he'd have a better payoff. Yeah. So then they started getting the gamblers who were kind of, you know, that would change things. Now the gamblers would want to bet with somebody who had the higher payoff, and then that would not be good overall, you know. So Shonder Burns was a guy who the numbers operators trusted to keep things running smoothly, to keep the profits coming in, to keep the cops at bay, and they really, the vast majority of them really liked him. He was a popular character, and he had an important role in the game.
He was kind of like on both sides of the law in a way. Even, I mean, is that right? I thought I remembered hearing about that. I mean, even the cops who were after him sort of had a grudging respect for him in a way, especially as he got older. I mean, when he's sort of in legitimate societies, his rabbi and different groups sort of smiled on him in a way, just he was sort of a nefarious character in a way who they just sort of laughed and went along with.
Well, yeah, I think they smiled, perhaps not approvingly, but certainly
right.
certainly knowingly. And you know, Shonder never changed. He was like that until the day he died, and everybody knew what he did. He never really tried to he never really tried to hide what he did. You know, he made his money, 90% of it illegally, and in different ways. One of the ways he also brought in money was being a fence. You know, he'd find buyers for stolen property, and that factored in with an important character in the book by the name of Mervyn Gold, who was this con man who fancied himself a racketeer. A guy liked to hang out with mobsters, but really he was just a businessman / con man. and he had loaned Shonder some money. And when Mervyn called the note, Shonder gave him like $1 million worth of these bonds, these bearer bonds that were actually stolen. And Mervyn Gold, after a while, the heat came to Cleveland because this was an international case. The bonds were stolen from Canada. And when the investigation kind of came to Cleveland, Mervyn Gold was told, hey, you need to burn those bonds. Don't do anything with those bonds. Well, Mervyn needed money, so he takes a portion of them to the bank, and he uses them as collateral to take out a loan. And well, one thing led to another, and the bank president learned that the bonds were stolen, and he calls Mervyn Gold in. Mervyn Gold says, I'll be in this afternoon. Instead, takes his family to New York, and they board a plane and wind up in Israel. And he's Mervyn Gold was a Jewish con man, and he attempted to return to Israel under their law of return,
right.
Which incidentally, I don't know how many years later it was, the same thing that Meyer Lansky tried.
Yeah.
And Israel, they fought it, and eventually they deported Mervyn, and he wound up back in Cleveland, had all kind of federal indictments, and he basically backed Shonder Burns into a corner about the bonds. Was trying to get money for his legal defense because he'd run out of money from Shonder Burns. Basically telling Shonder Burns, I mean, one of the most feared racketeers in Cleveland, like, my problems are your problems, Sean. So you got to help me. Well, you know, it went on for a few months, and then finally, I think Shonder had enough, and Mervyn Gold disappeared. They issued a warrant, a bench warrant for his arrest. Thought maybe he fled town. It wasn't the case. And there was a cop in a little village who was patrolling and noticed this car and looked at the license plate and checked his hot sheet and saw that that plate is wanted. And they wound up searching. They had a search party come out because it was down by a river. They thought maybe Mervyn Gold went down by the river and killed himself, you know. And then some bright police officer had the idea, hey, maybe we should check the trunk, you know. They probably should have checked the trunk first because unfortunately for Mervyn Gold, that's where they found him. He had been beaten and shot and strangled. And there was big headlines, big case. The coroner called a coroner's inquest, which was open to the public, and Shonder Burns was called to testify. And he had this young lady. I mean, Shonder was in his early 50s by then, and I think she was in her early 20s. Her name was Ellie. She was a Kent State University graduate who had become a teacher, and she was just smitten with this older man, and she remained loyal to him for years. But she testified on his behalf by basically not testifying because Shonder said that he was with her during this period of time that Mervyn Gold went missing, and she refused to testify. Shonder refused to testify, and pretty soon, this was, I think, 1962, 1963. Pretty soon the case was dropped. And then President Kennedy was killed, and Mervyn Gold kind of disappeared from the news, and Shonder Burns eventually went on his way, but always to be the number one suspect in the murder of Mervyn Gold.
Yeah, I had that question. He's how violent? How far was he willing to go with his violence? Obviously, when he's personally threatened like that, he might go all the way. Was he? His guys, his enforcers, were they instructed to go very far or not?
I think they were, depending on how much of a problem it was. Now, for a guy like Don King, Shonder had a guy in the. It's funny when you open the show, Gary, and you say, "What, wiretappers?" And they had a wiretap on Shonder. I think it was down in Florida, in Miami, and it was with the guys that I just mentioned, Jaime Martin and George Gordon. and they overheard this conversation. I was able to get my hands on the transcript, and Shonder Burns in Cleveland, he had a ranking police officer. This during the 1960s, and maybe going into the early 70s too, but definitely in the 60s. And he supposedly got a call from Shonder got a call from this police officer. He said, "Hey, look, Donald King he's come to the police department. He's looking for protection." And according to Shonder Burns telling this story, the cop told him, "Hey, look, if you're going to do anything, take it out. Take it outside of Cleveland. Take it outside of Cuyahoga County."
You got to do what you got to do sometimes.
But what Shonder mentioned to his friends, he said, "I wasn't planning on taking it with Donald King to that level, But yeah, if they needed to, he had guys like Bob Bogus, and let me see who else. There were a couple more, and they were very capable enforcers. Sometimes they used bombs, sometimes they used guns, and no doubt Shonder Burns was fully capable himself, but he was rather judicious with the use of the bomb or the bullet. And there comes in the other part of the title of the book, and that's the bribe. So he would pay guys. He was also known for fixing juries. He'd pay a juror. He might even pay a witness. Hey, or a victim. Here's $10,000. Go on vacation for your court date. And the investigators, with the detectives and the prosecutor, would be looking for this witness or victim, and eventually they'd have to drop the charges. So Shonder was very tactical the way he did things like that. He really thought things out, and was able to use the bribe to a great degree to benefit himself, especially when he got himself in trouble.
Yeah, you have to be much more like tactical is a good word. You have to be much more politically savvy. You might have to have a lot more connections to be able to bribe, know who to bribe, and know when to bribe, and when it's going to work, and how much to use, what amount. So that part of the title really impressed me. I think that anybody can use muscle or knows when to use a blackjack on somebody, but it's who to bribe and when is where you really get that political savvy.
Yeah, and his whole mindset was he was just he was strategic. He was strategic with what he did, and he knew he had certain tools at his disposal, but he used them. Cam, like you're saying, he figured what's the best to do in this particular case, and he was successful. And I mean, he's not a guy that amassed millions of dollars and then retired to Florida or Las Vegas, but he just kept his operations going. And I think he looked like a guy that kind of enjoyed his life. He'd go down to the clubs in the afternoon. He'd start at one club, and then in the later afternoon he'd wind up another club. Then he'd go to dinner, and then he'd wind up in the evening, maybe in another place, and driving around in his Cadillac. And I think he enjoyed the position that he had. I don't know if he ever really aspired to be retired. In fact, he once was quoted as saying something like, "I don't ever want to die or be in a rocking chair. Die in a rocking chair." And he is the end of the story. It's certainly not what happened with Shonder Burns.
So what about the babes? You mentioned the babes. What about the babes?
Oh yeah, he was just a real womanizer, and he had he was a club owner too. He had the Alhambra, that was probably the best known one, and he had a young girl who, she must have been 18 or 19 years old, who worked in the office with him. And he just had he fancied young women. He fancied women in their early 20s. And he fancied them when he was in his 30s, and when he was in his 40s, and when he's in his 50s. Always the women
and 60s and 70s.
Well, he didn't get quite to 70, but
Right.
I think he got pretty close. But yeah, so I mean, he was married. He was married to Jane, and they had one son. And then he met Ellie. She was a waitress at a restaurant that he frequented, and he was a big tipper, and I think that caught her attention. And she was sort of I guess, a tragic figure too. Her father had died kind of young. I don't know. I'm not a psychologist. Maybe that had something to do with her attraction to an older guy. But when she got involved with him, she was all in. She was loyal to a fault, and eventually they married. But he still had interest with other women, and one of them was connected to a group of Hell's Angels, and I think that also contributed to the motives that led to Shonder's demise.
Interesting. So let's talk about his demise.
Mhm.
Well, you had a conflict with Danny Green. Now that's kind of been well documented.
Yeah.
Even though it seems like people just I did a thing at a downtown place called the Music Box, popular thing, and they do a Cleveland Stories thing, and I've been there probably 5 times. They still wanted to hear about Danny Green all these years later, and the place was packed. And it's kind of like, let's talk about Shonder Burns, because that's my more recent title.
Yeah.
So we know that Danny Green was sort of a protege, really, of Shonder Burns. Shonder Burns was the mentor. Shonder Burns was the one who didn't mind talking to the reporters. I mean, he would sit down with them, he'd pick up their drinks, pick up dinner. That was something the Italians, they did not do. You don't talk to reporters. You don't become friendly with them. But Shonder did that, and later Danny Green was known for doing that too. Danny Green was known for being a womanizer. He was known for being an enforcer. So I mentioned, I think, that Shonder Burns at one point, the law enforcement here in Cleveland, they did have some success, because they tried like hell to put this guy behind bars, whether it be a county jail, state prison, or a federal pen. Didn't have much luck, but in the late 60s, they charged him and convicted him of bribery. He got a 3-year sentence, but he had a great attorney by the name of Jim Willis. In fact, Jim is still around. I think he's 95 years old.
Really?
Been practicing up until fairly recently. I'm not sure if he's still practicing. Very well known too, and very successful in the appeals arena. But Willis kept filing paperwork, and even though there was this conviction and this sentence of 3 years, it's like a year later, Shonder Burns is still on the streets. Well, he hires Danny Green, who had been, you might say, retired from the dock workers union, because he had been ousted for basically embezzling funds. He had also become an FBI informant. But I think we know enough about Danny Green. So Shonder Burns basically assigned Danny Green to watch over his business, his numbers operation, while he was going to be in prison for 3 years. So in the months leading up to him having like his appeals and all the paperwork running out, and him having to actually turn himself in, he started taking Danny Green around, showing him his operation, introducing him to the different important figures within the numbers racket. So that's what Danny Green did for Shonder. Shonder Burns went away for 3 years, and Danny Green oversaw his operation. The problem was that Danny Green was he was also overseeing Ellie. Okay,
Yeah.
does that make sense?
Yeah.
And I think Ellie was okay with it. She was I think she liked the attention, and they had an affair, I think, for a while. And of course, we know Danny Green was this fiercely proud Irishman who, everything was a color green cars, green Lincoln Continental, green sport jackets. He wrote in green ink, gave out green pens, gave out these gold Celtic crosses imported from Ireland. And he gave Ellie a green teddy bear. And I heard that from a friend who I was able to interview. Unfortunately, she she had died by the time I started working on the book. So they have this affair, and 3 years goes by, and then Shonder comes out of prison. He gets back into his numbers racket. Now Danny Green is pretty much out of a job, and there may have been some conflict over the fact that he had been having an affair with Ellie. So some bad blood develops. Danny Green borrows money that Shonder Burns gets for him from his connections with the New York mob. And the money winds up being lost by a drug courier. And Shonder blames Danny. Danny blames Shonder. And then during this period of time, Shonder gets involved with a woman by the name of Janie Jarris, who also likes to hang around Hell's Angels and also is also heavily involved with a Hell's Angel, winds up having a baby with him. She tries to distance herself from Shonder Burns, and Shonder really wasn't having any of it. So there was the guy that she was involved with, the Hell's Angel she was involved with, was a guy by the name of George Rothrock. Now, George Rothrock and 2 or 3 other Cleveland Hell's Angels were heavily into weapons, like heavy weapons, automatic rifles, machine guns, hand grenades, things like that, and bombs, explosives. They were part of a circle of people connected to different organized crime people that were sort of experts with explosives. So you had this George Rothrock who had a motive to get rid of Shonder Burns, and you had Danny Green who had this conflict that had escalated to he and Shonder going after each other, whether it be taking shots at each other or putting a bomb on each other's car, and so it escalated to the point that I believe, my research, as best as I could deduce, is that Danny Green, ordered Shonder Burns to be murdered, and one of his crew members, his chief enforcer by the name of Keith Ritson, along with George Rothrock, planted that bomb on Shonder Burns' car, and detonated it by remote control when moments after Shonder got in the car on Cleveland's near west side, West 25th and Detroit Avenue, and Shonder Burns was killed instantaneously. This was Holy Saturday of what was it? I think 1975, I believe, and it happened to be right across from this. It was an old Irish settlement, this church, St. Malachi, and you see in the movie Kill the Irishman, you see that scene is portrayed a little bit loosely, but it's portrayed with the church in the background. So mass was just starting. I think it was about 8 o'clock, and then this huge explosion goes off, and it kind of spoiled the Holy Saturday Mass there, and I suppose it spoiled Easter for some of the homicide detectives too, because when morning light came, they had to go back to the scene and start literally picking up the pieces and evidence and all that. And that was the end. It was a very big, dramatic end. Probably Shonder Burns would have signed off on that. Like you said, he didn't never wanted to die in a rocking chair. I suppose he didn't want to be blown out the roof of his Lincoln Continental, but that's how he met his maker.
Well, there's nothing like going out in a blaze of glory.
In the movie, I think afterward, Christopher Walken was interviewed again about that scene. I think they asked him, like, because he's pulling open the door, and boom, the explosion goes off, and they asked him like how that was done. He said, "I have no idea. I wasn't there." Like what they did. That all
mystery.
Afterward, the explosion, and then in editing and all that. So he was a character, quite a good character. I mean, the movie was I tell people the movie is really the Hollywood version of the story. Now, I'm absolutely thrilled that it got made, and the actors, actresses. I mean, Vincent D'Onofrio and Val Kilmer, and
some
Christopher
good ones.
Walken. Great talent. So I'm proud, and I'm very fortunate. But it's definitely the Hollywood story, like many movies are.
Yeah.
They take their liberties with the story.
That mentorship role that you described, right? That's really interesting. You see that touched on a little bit in the film, but really, that really explains a lot about how a guy like Danny Green really sort of ascended to where he was. I mean, I mean, on more than just sort of balls alone. I mean, he had to have sort of that gateway. And it sounds like sort of seeing Shonder and seeing those connections, and especially Shonder going into prison and opening that door for Danny while he was there. That really makes a lot more sense. Understanding that path was paved for him in a way. That mentorship sort of role and going away. That really does explain that his entry a lot better, as I understand.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the connections, though, for Danny had already, at least I think he was starting to make a name for himself in the Longshoremen's Union.
Yeah.
He had become the president, so he now starts hanging out with these guys, and some of these labor unions, like in a lot of the big cities during the from probably the 30s through to the 70s, they were, as they say, as Jim Neff, the author and newspaper man, would say, they were mobbed up.
Yeah.
They had clear connections to organized crime figures. So that was the circle that Danny Green was kind of moving in, hanging out at places like the fabled Theatrical Bar and Grill, where you'd have prosecutors and defense attorneys and judges sitting at this table, and then you'd have bookies and racketeers and organized crime bosses sitting at another table. So his name was being made. But yes, guys like Shonder Burns and also Frank Brancato, who was a Cleveland mob lieutenant, and also needed Shonder's services as an enforcer to run his gambling operations, not run them, but to step in and help when needed. Guys like that, yeah, they did kind of pave the way a little bit. But Danny Green was also definitely his own man. He was a strong, independent character, and then eventually it was his alliance with John Hardy, who was an important character, another labor union official and organized crime mafia associate, who kind of made a bid to take over the Cleveland Mafia when John Scalish died. So yeah, but Danny was definitely a character, just like Shonder Burns.
Shonder, yeah.
Yeah, they weren't the kind of the opposite of what the mafia was supposed to be. They were bigger than life. They were brash. They were loud. Like I said, they'd go on camera. They'd talk to reporters, and that plays into one of the questions I would get sometimes as I do these presentations, around town, which has become kind of a nice sideline for it. People ask, well, how come you never wrote a book about John Scalish? He was the Cleveland Mafia boss for like 4 decades or so. And that's a good question. I had to think about that. And you know why? Because John Scalish was quiet. He operated under the radar. He had the money coming in. He had a vending company, and he'd go out on his boat, and he had his political connections and everything, but he wasn't this larger than life, brash, loud person who would be happy to sit down with newspaper reporters. But that's exactly what Shonder Burns was, and then following him, what Danny Green was. And I think that's what attracted me to write about them, and I think that's what attracted so many people to enjoy the story, and that's what attracted Hollywood to adapt the book for motion picture.
There's definitely something to be said for picking the right characters and picking the interesting stories. I mean, there's the mob's one thing would being able to cherry pick and find the story in a sea of stories. I mean, that's really says something, Rick. I mean, it really does. There's a real talent to that.
Well, I hope my talent continues.
Well, I think it will.
Here's to you.
Another motion picture adaptation.
Yeah,
we got Super Thief out there, and they were ready to move forward, and then COVID hit. I'm not complaining, because a lot of people were hit a heck of a lot worse, and we lost a heck of a lot of people due to that damn pandemic. But
Really?
yeah, so I'm hoping that things will continue to move forward now that we're getting kind of hopefully post pandemic.
Now remind me of Super Thief. That you got that book out there, right?
Yeah, Super Thief came
Mhm.
out. Oh gosh, when? Boy, I'm not even sure. It's been out for a while. I want to say maybe 2005.
Okay.
And it's basically the story, the inside story by Phil Christopher, a notorious burglar of the biggest bank burglary at the time,
Yeah.
the biggest bank burglary in U.S. history, and his association with the mafia. He was an associate, another guy that really didn't want to get too involved with them, but he was a master burglar and had his own crew and worked with guys from Youngstown, Northeast Ohio, the Denzio brothers. These were all master burglars. And the big bank job that I referred to was in 1972 in Orange County, California, and Laguna Niguel, California. So it's a big story with some interesting characters. There's a documentary out about it, and so I've got my fingers crossed. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, that'd be a good one. I like those caper movies. You don't get enough of them. I think they're hard to make. And like Heat was a caper movie. That was, and the Super Thief, probably Heat maybe was based on that a little bit.
Well, I think I think of the film. I told the original producer, who is actually the same one who kind of shepherded To Kill the Irishman to the big screen, Tommy Reed. I told Tommy, and I think he agreed. It's going to be the next big heist flick, So we'll see. I think we're getting close.
Good. No, keep our
Good
fingers
deal.
crossed on
Good
that
deal.
one. Interesting. All right, Cam, you got any more questions?
No, nothing for him. I'm just glad to get a chance to talk to Rick again and be on the show again.
All right, Rick, we really appreciate you coming on. We got this book here, folks. I'll put pictures of it up, and I'll have links on my show notes, Bombs, Bullets, and Bribes. And then we've got Super Thief too. I think you guys might be interested in reading that. I've not read it. I know a little bit about the stories we talked before, and I may have to pick that up. I believe I will.
Yeah, it's actually it went out of print, but as they get close to green lighting the film, I think we're going to go back to print and issue a new edition. I think it's out there in ebook form.
It's always going to be an ebook, isn't it? And there'll be used books out there. You click on that, and there'll be a bunch of used bookstores. Well, that first book I wrote, I was just putzing around. It never really sold anything. It wasn't even a Bob book. But I was putzing around. I see that there's an autographed copy out there at some thrift store in the United States. I thought, oh, well, that's interesting.
Was it going for $100?
No, afraid not. I think it was I think it was free with pay the postage, if I remember right.
I'm sorry to hear. Mine usually go for $5 above retail. Now, if I get whacked, that'll be a different story.
Yeah, that'll make it a lot better.
Right.
Actually, one last question: were the Porrellos in Kansas City? Was Joe Agosto? Was he a relative or not? I can't remember if I asked you or not.
That was never clear in my mind. I believe he may have been, but yeah, the Porrellos. I think you're speaking of
Angelo.
There's Joe Porrello and Angelo Porrello. Right. Yes, they were cousins. I even remember my father speaking of them and of those connections to Kansas City. Yes.
Yeah. Angelo died in prison actually not too long ago. He's about 90-some years old when he died. He and his son Joe had they contracted with some young guys, some young black guys, and they did a big jewelry heist down in the Plaza really nice shopping area, and it all fell apart on them when the robbers, the robbery crew started breaking apart. Then the whole thing fell apart on them, and the main guy broke down on everybody and then testified against the father and son and put them in for quite a while.
Yeah, it's kind of sad to see, a guy of his age wind up involved in something like that. Mm-hmm. And they gotta go to prison and then die in prison. I think his brother Joe, wasn't he killed in I don't know, in the 1960s?
Oh man,
I'm pretty sure he was.
But this was his son that was caught up. They had a pawn shop that were caught up in that burglary, in that jewelry robbery.
Yeah, but Angelo had a brother,
Had
I
a
think a
brother.
younger brother. I think he was younger, actually, I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure his name was Joe, and I think he was murdered in the 1960s. And they were, they were Kansas City mafia members, soldiers, associates.
Yeah. Interesting. All right. Well, thanks a lot, Rick. I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Good to be here, Gary. Thank you, Cam, and thank you, everyone.
All right,
Great to talk to you, Rick.
Cam, thanks. We'll be in touch.
Absolutely.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Folks, don't forget, if you want to get any of my books or anything, go to my website, www.ganglandwire.com. If you want to get any of Rick's books, I tell you what, you can just Google Rick Porrello, Porrello, and you'll find them. And we've given you the titles. I'll have notes or links in the show notes. If you look out for motorcycles out there, if you think you might have a problem with PTSD and you've been in the service, go ahead and Google PTSD and the Veterans Administration. And I promise you there's a hotline and there's a lot of help for you out there. So thanks a lot, folks.